I also see some very familiar, friendly faces. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Dr. Theo Meek. I am with the NSHE System Administration, and I have the opportunity to serve as the Senior Research Analyst and have been intimately involved with the co-requisite work as we have developed it throughout the entire policy process, formulation to passage to implementation. I want to thank the folks that we have on this call, Heidi, Joy, and Brandon, who have all been instrumental in a successful implementation. And I also want to thank the funders that have provided the opportunity for this, this professional development, along with the series of professional development activities to happen. And that is the Strong Start to Finish and ECMC Foundations for their generous support and investment into the Nevada system. I believe, and I think you all would agree, that COVID, along with many of the other, issues that 2020 has brought forth, civil unrest, racial discrimination, and whatnot, many of these that affect our students have the potential to derail the good, important work that we are doing. And I think that with the investments from those two grantor organizations, they have really provided us guiding light to stay the course through implementation. So thank you. And before I pass it off to Dr. Brandon Protas, I just want to thank the English Professional Development Task Force and the Greater NSHE Implementation Task Force. There are many faculty, some of whom are on this call, have been working tirelessly throughout the past year to support implementation as we move to full-scale implementation by fall 2021. So thank you all, and I will pass it off to Dr. Protas.
Thank you so much. Just want to make everyone aware we are recording this session, and we do that because we know while there's a lot of people on today's call, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be watching this after the fact. So we did want to make you aware of it. My name is Brandon Protas. I am a strategy director at Complete College America. We are thrilled to be partnering with NSHE and all of the colleges and universities in Nevada to be leading this professional development series. We always like to start off telling you who Complete College America is. We have a singular focus, and you see this in our mission and in our vision, and that is we are focused on increasing college completion rates while closing equity, or what we like to call institutional performance gaps. Even though that sounds like two things, we see that as a singular focus because they're one and the same. And it's important for us to realize that the way we're going to do this is through the institutions themselves. We know that we can make a difference that make a difference in the lives of students. So not putting that onus or responsibility on students, but rather on how we can have an impact on that. And as you'll see in the next slide, this fits with our theory of practice. And so you see here our pillars and strategies. These are divided into 4 areas. That includes purpose, momentum, structure, and support. And the strategies that you see, and I've highlighted co-requisite support. When I said there's things that we can do that make a difference, we know that co-requisite support makes a difference, and we've seen huge improvements in terms of pass rates and success rates, not only in the English classes, but on through graduation, not only for all students, but when we break it down specifically for Black students, Latinx students who historically we've seen being left behind. And so we wanted you to see that co-requisite as a part of an entire integrated set of strategies that we know make a difference for our students. We want to make sure that you can stay connected to Complete College America. So beyond this professional development series, if you go to completecollege.org, you'll see a space to sign up. You can get the latest from that. You will receive our newsletters. We have a new report actually on co-requisite support that's going to be coming out at the top of the year. Access to the experts in the field. There's just so much information. We'd love to stay connected with you through Complete College America. Want to remind you of the upcoming series. Again, I give my hats off to the English faculty task force, who really said if we're going to do co-requisite support right in the state, we need not just one professional development opportunity, but we need an entire series. And they helped really define what those topics were, the organizations and the presenters. And so on this, and you should be able to get this from your college or university, you'll see a list not only of the upcoming professional development opportunities in the new calendar year, but also the ones that we've had in the past for either you or colleagues if you want to watch some of those recorded sessions. I will say you are in luck, or today's just going to be a great day, because you will remember Heidi and Joy, who presented at our last one, giving a sort of co-rec 101 about English pedagogy and what that looks like in a co-requisite classroom. Well, they're back with more, and I know there was a lot of questions about English placement methodologies. I will give it over to them in just a second. I will point out one last thing is I will put in the chat now, and I'll do it at the end, a link to the evaluation of today's session. It's important for NSHE to hear what people like and what people don't like. So at the end of the session, if you can take just a few minutes to complete that, that would be great. With that, I will hand it over to Heidi and Joy.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you. I am Joy Palmer. I'm the Department Chair of English at the College of Western Idaho, which is the largest community college in our state and serves Boise and Nampa and kind of the greater metro area.
Hi everyone, it's nice to see a few names that are the same, and then probably some of you are here for the first time. I'm Heidi Estrom. I'm the director of the first year writing program at Boise State University and Department of English faculty. I have been there since 2006 doing this work, and I'm delighted to be here and to be working on this with Joy today.
Okay, so our schedule is kind of what we're doing here. Welcome, some opening remarks kinds of things. And then we'll talk about some kind of like big picture ideas regarding writing placement, and then focus in on what we do on our campuses, and then kind of broaden back out a little bit and work through a framework of kind of questions to consider, guidelines for kind of designing a strong placement methodology, or a workable placement methodology at least, and then some time for Q&A. We are going to have pauses at the end of each of those first two bigger sections to get a feel for the room, have some questions, or just hear what's resonating for you. And yeah, I think that's it. Oh, and we'll insert a short break at some point about roughly halfway through, so people can get a drink or whatever they need to do.
A couple things. Feel free to use the chat as we go along. Joy is better at handling in the moment chat questions than I am. We have built in several pauses, like Joy mentioned, where we will kind of stop after a segment and ask for more questions, and you can either unmute your mic or drop something in the chat then. So if you put something in the chat and we don't answer it right away, we will eventually get to it, even if we don't right at that minute. We do want to make sure we acknowledge out loud how taxing these can be, these kinds of sessions. We know it's Friday at the end of a really busy week, and so we won't be offended if you have to keep your camera off, or if you need to take a break even when we don't have one scheduled. Of course, do all you can to be comfortable. And then we do want to make sure we acknowledge that it's the end of the fall semester of 2020, and this, if it was anything like it's been on our campuses, was the hardest teaching we've done in our lives. And so thank you for all you're doing. Thank you for making the time to even be at a session like this near the end of the semester. And you should feel good about having survived, or even maybe found ways to thrive in this year.
Okay, we are going to launch a poll, and I may need Brandon or Heidi to launch it for me, because I cannot see that button right now for some reason. But we just sort of want to get a feel for the room. So we have, hey, there we go. What are your feelings right now about making changes to placement on my campus? How do you feel? Excited? Pleased was the best word I could come up with for kind of like, I'm generally positive, but maybe not like jumping out of my chair. Tired, concerned, whatever it might be.
Joy, are you able to see it?
No.
So it looks like it's pretty. Aren't the memes great? Joy made me so happy when she showed me the screen. So Brandon, if you want to, yeah, go ahead and share results. I think that's all.
Thank you. Okay, well, that's a quite a balance there between kind of more positive and more. I am surprised at how few are tired. That is my takeaway. I expected tired to be like 90%, and that was going to be the dominant emotion because it's 2020 December. Thank you, Brandon, for your help on that. And that's helpful for us to know, because that does mean our crowd is a little varied, and I think we expected that, but it's kind of good to see exactly what that's going to look like.
So our goals today, you asked for some practical strategies on doing writing placement in the best ways possible, given your current constraints. So we have 3 goals today. We want to give you very briefly some insights into kind of big picture thinking about placement, review just a tiny bit of the research in the field. This will be definitely review for some of you, or will be a refresh or a new line of inquiry for others. Then we're going to show you kind of snapshots of how we do placement at our 2 campuses. This is intended more as a way to give you an example rather than any encouragement to do exactly the same thing. So then at the end, we'll also come back and kind of give you some principles and strategies to think through as you consider what's right for you, especially in this particular moment of 2020 and 2021 when you think about tackling something like writing placement.
All right, and then our outcomes, the things that we kind of hope you leave with, is that you are committed or recommitted to writing placement as justice and equity work among one of the many institutional commitments that we all have, and that you have generated some clear next steps for conversations about writing placement on your own campus. So kind of a concrete, this is the next thing I or we are going to do.
All right, so that's that first section we mentioned. This is a little bit of big picture context. So we want to very briefly review some highlights from the state of writing assessment research. Obviously, we have people on this call who also have expertise in this area. As with everything, placement decisions are rhetorical decisions, which is why we've called them better practices rather than best practices. We should always aim to do the best we can within the context that we have and within the realities of the constraints that we have. To do the best we can, or maybe even just to do a little better than what we're doing now. So here's a picture of your beautiful Sierra Nevadas. We want to preface what we're saying here with a caveat that writing placement operates within a system and within an ecology. And so on its own, it's no solution to the real challenges facing higher ed more generally, or first year writing more specifically. We're not going to solve poverty. We're not going to solve child hunger with our placement process. So it operates within an ecosystem, even on a campus. However, at the same time, each part within this institute, within this ecology, deserves attention. So we talked about co-requisite pedagogy before. I love the topics that you have coming up, thinking about related to co-requisite. There's placement, there's labor issues. There are many things that inform our work, campus politics, and placement is one really important piece where we can make a difference in students' lives, but it's also affected by all of those other pieces. So sound writing placement will work better when there is a climate of will work better when the curriculum is informed by similar values, when the labor model is healthy, when there is a climate of student-focused energy on campus and across the state. So just keep that in mind, that even today, as we home in on writing placement and we share some of these examples and then talk through our specific examples, keep that kind of context caveat in mind.
So to get started, disciplinary conversations about writing placement have argued against kind of single standardized test scores for several decades now, and they argue that sound assessment is contextual, which matches, of course, what Heidi was talking about with regarding location, but also regarding the student's context, that it engages multiple measures and is context specific, and that basing placement decisions on a standardized test score is racist and violates better practices. And you can see some of the references there. There is a bibliography at the end where you'll find kind of more extensive information about the things, the specific studies and such that we're citing here and elsewhere.
So we did want to pause for a minute and break down this term that we hear a lot, especially in terms of writing placement, which is the idea of multiple measures. So it can cause some confusion because there are at least two different distinct ways in which this term is used. So first, in writing assessment scholarship, multiple measures is often used to mean an integrated way to arrive at a singular decision. So for example, it's usually rooted in portfolio-based assessment. So there are multiple different samples that give us a fuller picture of what a student can do. Recent iterations of writing placement approaches, including our own, including the ones that Joy and I will talk about, attempt to do what I would call a different version of this. So they seek to integrate multiple pieces of data in a way that informs ultimately a placement. Often this isn't possible for a number of the constraints we just briefly mentioned. So another definition of multiple measures means something more like variety. So offering several single measures. And this is, you'll hear more commonly in the, at least I have, in the CCA dialogue, and then also in the TICA white paper that we'll talk about later. I should know what TICA stands for, and now all I can think of it is as TICA, but that's okay. It's in our references. So, for example, a student is placed by an SAT score or a standardized test score or a GPA and so on, right? So it's multiple discrete single measures. So each of these two options, of course, has benefits and challenges, but anything you do that moves away from a single test score, which sounds like you kind of have to do, is going to be to the student's benefit.
All right, so writing scholars have developed and reported on a variety of alternatives to single measure standardized test scores for writing placement, kind of like Heidi was talking about, including the portfolio, and then sometimes looking at direct writing samples. So maybe it's not multiple measures, it's a single one. Directed self-placement, where the student is given some information to help guide their own decision. And in some cases, just no placement. Students are all placed into the same place or select a course without any kind of guidance whatsoever from the English folks, the faculty, any kind of administration.
So I wanted to share this quote with you, which is from an article and then also a special issue of the Journal of Writing Assessment that I find especially helpful and even provocative in thinking through some of these issues. Jessica Nastall writes, "A placement method that is more successful, that better serves students, might not exist. If placement cannot predict course level or sequence success, or if placement serves to penalize students outside the white middle class mainstream, then it is worth radically reconsidering or eliminating the apparatus." So this is, and she's talking more specifically about the community college context. This can be a little bit unsettling to think about what this means. But anyway, the kind of thinking that informs this special issue has helped us continue to wrestle with what are we doing and why, and how does it affect our students.
So before we continue on and talk about our own placement processes, are there any questions or comments?
And feel free to unmute and just say it or type it in the chat. We'll try and pause for a minute at least. A minute where I actually wait a minute, like I always say that in my class. Oh, 5 minutes. And then I never remember to actually look at the time. I like Todd's point about labor. I think labor is a key challenge all of us have faced and unfortunately are likely to continue to face in the next several years. All right, well, maybe we'll go ahead and move on and we'll talk about what we do, and then that might provoke different questions.
So we'd like to talk a bit about our context in Idaho, kind of more generally, and then we'll give snapshots of what we're doing at each of the institutions.
So this is a picture from our state, of our sawtooth range. Our work to reform placement in our state sprang from a really different exigence and a different moment, and we work in a different ecology. So we began working on this years ago, like in about 2007 and 8 even. And so everything feels like it was different than it is now. So we know that specific examples and stories can be helpful, and can maybe provoke different thinking for you as you think about your own institution. So we want to share our stories with you, not because we did things perfectly, but because we hope it can show the power of cross-institution collaboration and faculty-driven reforms.
And we do want to start with a few caveats. So for one thing, your mileage will vary. Any particular approach is going to work differently in different institutions for any variety of reasons. But so context, as we've said a couple of times, matters a lot. Also, there's no perfect placement process. We are, of course, trying to get at fairer, more just mechanisms, but there's always going to be individual students who would have been better served by a different tool than the one that you are using at that moment. And so the goal is not every 100% of students get the most perfect placement support or help or whatever possible. And we will not be able to solve all of society's inequities with placement, and students will continue to come in at varying levels, but we can attempt to account for our own biases in that placement, so that we do kind of come from the standpoint that a student who's been admitted to our institution is a qualified student who, deserves to be in a college level writing course, and we are going to serve those students as best as we can, and whatever placement tool we are using should, still, the goal of placement, I guess, is not to determine whether a student is qualified. At the point that they are admitted, they are already qualified. It's just helping match them to the best course possible.
So in Idaho, English department chairs and writing coordinators generally meet at least once a year. And beginning in about 2007, we started working together on ways to collaborate better across our institutions and to address issues that we felt like were impacting student learning on all of our campuses. At that time for us, there were existing policies that we felt posed a challenge. And so together as faculty, we stumbled through kind of figuring out how to address those. Placement for us early on, the two issues were placement and then getting credit for writing courses, because at that time we had courses that were non-credit bearing and we were required to keep them that way. As faculty, we were concerned about fairness to students. We wanted courses to be credit bearing. We knew that single measure placement was problematic. At that time, we had a grid of SAT, ACT, and Compass scores and AP that we were required to follow. I think it's important to note too, this is part of that ecology piece. Our state policymakers valued transparency, transferability, and transparency. Those were the kind of the values that they brought to the table and the concerns they had over changing placement. So the short story is that we worked together for what felt like a decade. I think it was maybe 4 years on some of these issues that you are now changing pretty quickly or thinking through pretty quickly.
So some of the specific kind of background regarding placement is that we had state set placement scores that worked for a couple of standardized tests. It was primarily Compass, unless students had a certain level of ACT or SAT scores. Multilingual student placement varied at different campuses, sort of a lot based on whether they were kind of students coming in from our local communities, whether from high school or having taken a GED or something like that, versus like an international student population. Generally speaking, placement varied depending on which of those populations was larger for multilingual students. Among faculty and writing program administrators and department chairs, there was certainly concern with students being in sort of the developmental courses, or once we had co-rec in the co-rec who may not have needed it. But there was also a whole lot of displeasure with students who were placed directly into the second semester writing course based on a test score that was largely assessing syntax and mechanics, and who were not prepared for writing pretty lengthy essays and other kinds of writing projects that dealt with using lots of sources and synthesizing ideas and all of those sorts of things. It's also worth noting that our move to co-requisite at some institutions came before placement changes. And so that was one way we saw even early on in having co-rec that those placement mechanisms we'd been using, like Compass, ACT, and SAT, were still putting students into that didn't necessarily need those extra credits or credit. And at least at my institution, our faculty did a lot of work to affirm placement and kind of swap students between the co-rec and the 101 by itself during that first week of classes. So when the state started moving toward looking at things like co-requisite support and encouraging multiple measures placement, I think the feel of department chairs and writing administrators and faculty was, hey, this is an opportunity that we can kind of exploit to do something really cool before someone tells us what to do. So that is the context we kind of had as we move into what Boise State did, and then later I will talk about what CWI did.
Yeah, so couple things. I'll skip over this. Joy said this. I mean, I'll skip over it quickly. Our exigence at the time is that there was a clear felt sense that placement wasn't working especially well, even from instructors in the classroom. And then an important key piece on continuing the placement discussion on our campus at that time, since we had no external support and in fact a lot of external reservations about making any changes to placement, was when our institutional assessment office did a study of writing and math placement, the correlation between scores and grades or success in English courses. Our institutional assessment person did find some consistency for math at that point, but found none for English. So she said to me, she came to me with this report and she said, you might as well have students come to orientation and flip a coin. And it seemed pretty problematic to be either charging people money, which is what we were doing if they were taking a secondary placement process, or using ACT scores or SAT scores when it had no correlation. That did not seem to be a way to serve students especially well. So, all right. Go ahead. Yeah. So we were given the opportunity on our campus and at other campuses across the state to pilot some options, some different alternatives. So we assembled a campus-wide team. We thought a lot about what kind of writing assessment placement process would be exciting and would make us feel proud that we were using it. And so we asked ourselves questions like, what if we thought of placement as the beginning of a conversation with students, an opportunity for them to reflect? What would it mean to prioritize student reflection in the placement process? And those are values that we have in our program, values that we infuse into our teaching. And what would it mean if even that placement moment, however brief, kind of began that work for students? And then we wondered we at that time were really aware of the best practices, good models in our fields of DSP and portfolio-based placement. And we thought, what does it look like to integrate those in some way? So have a lot of student reflection, a lot of student choice and input, but then also to acknowledge and draw on faculty expertise for some kinds of decisions. So our goal was to think less about sorting students and more about matching them. And then, kind of wondered what this kind of placement might look like. So we developed and remodeled and revised over years after starting on a Google site and then figuring out as we went what it was we were actually building. We wanted to think through, develop a process that balanced our local context and realities with what we knew better placement could be. We knew, for example, that we didn't have the capacity or the funding to do, let's say, large scale for portfolio-based placement for all incoming students in the summer. We couldn't fairly process 5,000 students a summer in this kind of meaningful portfolio-based placement. We wanted to integrate multiple measures. At that time, our provost had required that whatever we built included test scores. I think test scores now, the knowledge about test scores has accumulated, so I don't think that's as pressing as it was at that point, but we had to honor that commitment we had made to him. We knew at that time, and have it more evidence now, about the helpfulness of GPA, and so that was included. We wanted to integrate some of the aspects of directed self-placement or DSP models where students assess themselves. And then we also wanted, because one of the challenges that you likely face or that we definitely face is that students come into English 101 and don't know what it is. They think they're signing up for grammar or for Shakespeare. And so we wondered what a placement process would look like that might help students, even without explicitly saying that that's why we were having them do this, but do things like review brief course descriptions or think about the instructor assumptions connected to each course. And then we also wanted students to reflect on and think about their overall workload and capacity and commitments as part of that process. So over time, we developed these into all of these aspects, and then worked to develop an algorithm that weights each of these differently. And students now complete what we call the right class prior to orientation, and it's integrated with our student information system. So students' right class assessment results serves as their placement and helps them be able to register for class. So thanks to the statewide work, we had this opportunity to pilot something different. Nope, not the right slide, sorry. We have learned a few things along the way, the last however many years it's been now. We've learned we can outperform a standardized test, although that's, in fairness, a pretty low bar. That was what our provost at the time had asked us to do. And she said, well, as long as whatever you do can be at least as good. And so we had one fall to fall comparison where the only thing that changed was a full implementation of the right class. And in that fall to fall comparison, it was about it was over 100 students, between 100 and 150 students who in the previous fall would have been likely to fail, were able to pass because of the changes to placement. Another thing we've learned that we didn't think about necessarily quite as explicitly from the beginning is that our placement is tied much more closely to our curriculum now. So when changes happen to our course descriptions, we can easily update our placement process. Or if we decide, ooh, there's really this critical skill in our first semester class that we want to help students begin to think about as they're thinking about placement, we can adjust our placement to that. And then again, and this I think is true for you, which I think is a good thing, the stakes for placement are different when everything is credit bearing and everything counts towards graduation. And that's a good thing from my perspective. There have been also some unanticipated benefits. So when we began this work, our university assessment office testing center handled all handled all testing, all standardized testing. We took that on through some different, there was kind of some changes also in funding, but the advantage is that we have that work, we have that responsibility in our office, but we also have that responsibility, and that's a good thing. We get to see what's happening. We see if there are glitches. We see how students are interacting with things. We can be flexible. So like I mentioned earlier, when things change, we can change the right class. TWC is what we shorten the right class to. We can use the right class as a way just to get early information to students. So to help kind of facilitate advising or connections, even kind of purposes that are slightly beyond placement, and that might be available to students elsewhere, but this at least gives us one more chance, one more opportunity to say, you know, we noticed that you're a multilingual student. Did you know that there's this office for you, or there's this resource? That kind of being able to give information has been important. And then just briefly, the nuanced placement results. Joy's going to talk a little bit more about this. That has been really important and powerful for us. So during the same time frame, CWI was also experimenting with placement. I did see a question come up. Todd, I'm going to go. So Todd, your question, what is your that there? Can you say what you mean? The provost. Yes, part of it. So we had two at the time. We had two issues for why we didn't go full DSP. First, we weren't confident that we could really get students enough information when they were seniors in high school to be able to make a decision that would serve them well for going into our second semester class. We were concerned that there would be too much pressure on them from family members, from a variety of places that might encourage them to overplace themselves. And that is a real pressure, but we also knew that students would be much better served at our institution if they took both classes. So Joy will talk a little bit more about how we kind of have that other, have an opportunity for students to begin in that second semester course, but we did not feel that DSP would serve students well for going directly into our second semester course. So that is one, and then we also had that provost kind of mandate or request from the very beginning. Yep. Thanks. Good question. All right, Joy. Oh, is this already where we are? Here we are.
Yeah.
Okay.
We got to pause here. So if there are any other ideas that are resonating, we'd love to hear about that, or questions that you might have either about our state context or some of the stuff Heidi's shared so far. And do feel free to unmute or comment. Either of those is great. All right. If a comment comes up, I will pause, but since I have not heard anything, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the writing placement at the College of Western Idaho. So we kind of were very aware of what was happening at Boise State at the time. As Heidi said, we're just down the road. We are, part of the same state that meets pretty regularly, and because we're just down the road and have faculty who teach at both places and things like that, we tend to have a lot of communication between campuses and be aware when major things are happening. And so we had a similar situation. We had a group of faculty and a few other folks at the college who were working on responding to our state kind of guidelines to move towards some kind of multiple measures placement tool. And we knew pretty early on that we could and probably would use a version of the right class, but also knew that the right class as Boise State uses it might not best fit our kind of community college population, and that there were some things that we wanted to do a little bit differently. In addition, we wanted to make sure, and some of this is the same, that whatever we did was scalable, that if there was going to be manual kind of placement labor attached to it, that would go towards the students where it can like make the most of a difference in making sure a student is in the right class. And that kind of ties in really nicely with the idea of decision zones. So we did research directed self-placement at the time. And at the time, kind of like Deborah, I think mentions here, I don't know that we were as worried about resources and informed decisions, but we were very worried about the lack of research in community colleges. I think we were able to find like one published thing about DSP at community colleges when we were first looking. I have now seen lots more, and colleges were doing it at the time, but we were not able to kind of point to something and be like, yeah, this would probably be fine. And so we were really interested in this idea of decision zones, and what that is like kind of in the context of directed self-placement is that you identify, you use something, whether it's a single tool or something like the right class, to kind of identify these smaller groups of students who are right on the edge of a placement decision. And then those students kind of have the DSP sort of experience where they get to choose between taking co-rec or not taking co-rec, or going into the first semester writing class or going into the second semester writing class. So that was important to us. And then affordability was very, very important to us, because something that was going to be labor intensive was simply not going to be something we could get funded. So many of our measures are the same as Boise State's, though we do have some slight tweaks. The biggest difference is we added a reading and then a reading, and it's a short piece that I think is excerpted from an op-ed of some kind. And we added a reading comprehension quiz on that. That has been extremely useful when we've been asked by students to review placement because they want to challenge where they ended up, or when we are doing any kind of manual placement processes, which I'll talk about in a moment here. That ability to understand and work with source material seems to be one of the more crucial distinctions for us between who does and doesn't need co-rec. We do have a multilingual reading and writing history that our students who indicate English is not their primary or first language and who have not completed at least 4 years in a US school complete. So it's just one additional piece of information for some of our multilingual students. And then there are other parts of the tool that aren't part of the placement kind of algorithm, but they are that more informational part and some of that reflection piece, so that if the student ends up in one of those decision zones, those experiences hopefully inform their choice. For the most part, students will get an immediate result. They may be placed into co-rec, in which case they do not have a choice. They may be placed into the college level course, but be recommended to take the co-rec. So that's our first decision zone. So it's a band of students who, you know, we think it might be helpful, but we also feel like the student probably can make the decision that which they would prefer. A lot of times this is the student we're kind of envisioning in this situation is either a returning student who maybe doesn't have a test score or high school GPA to kind of be part of the decision. So where we're missing kind of pieces of information that go into that algorithm that might make a difference, or maybe a student who has struggled a bit, but is able to kind of do that self-assessment piece to make their choice. They can be placed into college level and then they get information about the co-rec. So everyone gets information about the co-rec, but we don't really see that as much of a decision zone. And then students who are placed into the college level writing course, but they're invited to apply for the second semester course, English 102. And that English 102 app, at least at CWI, can be triggered by the multiple measures, or it can be triggered by extremely high standardized test scores that had historically placed students into 102. Part of that was responding to concern from other constituents on the campus about students who, you know, had a 32 on their ACT or something along those lines. it has not proven to be a big issue so far. Students who choose to apply for 102 write a few paragraphs about why they feel 102 is the correct place for them to start, and they submit writing samples, hopefully that demonstrate their proficiency in kind of the 101 course outcomes that they have heard about over the course of the write class. These are reviewed by writing faculty. Over 90% of our students who do apply are placed into English 102, and others are given the option to resubmit work. The most common reason that happens is if a student, say, only submits like a one-page piece of writing, or submits like fiction or poetry or something that's just kind of completely missed the content of a first year writing course, where we can't actually kind of make that decision. And the one exception to getting that placement is that all of our students who go through the multilingual track are placed manually. So a faculty member will go in, read the writing sample, review the other scores, and then give one of those placements or place the students into one of our credit-bearing ESL writing courses, or in some cases a not credit-bearing but free bridge program that's a partnership with our basic skills. And that's not really based on student level, that's based on whether we have enough students to offer a credit-bearing course. So right now, the numbers are so small that our students are working with basic skills because it's fewer than 10 a semester, and we just don't have the enrollment to run those courses. The vast majority of our multilingual students are just in our co-rec. Okay. So some of the things that we've learned is that our institution really likes lots of options. So they really like the idea of multiple measures, where that means students have multiple ways to kind of have a placement. So there are a few things like an SAT essay score of 6 or higher, where a student places directly into English 101. And then the write class is optional. They would only take it if they wanted to start in English 102. And then other students don't need to take the write class if they have credit for any of the first year writing sequence. So if they already have English 101 credit, they don't have to take the write class to tell them that, yes, in fact, you're going to take English 102. We also use, in less so in English 102, more so in English 101 and our co-recs, first day writing samples to kind of help affirm placement. And particularly because our model, if you were here last time, is that we have a 101 with like 10 of the students out of the full course are in the co-requisite. Our instructors sometimes shift students between co-rec and 101 in that first week, most commonly out of co-rec, but sometimes into co-rec if a student is particularly anxious. And in fact, it's very rarely because an instructor looks at the writing and is like, oh, you might need co-rec. It's much more likely that the student is like, I am freaking out, and that's what happens there. Let's see. We needed to have a plan for students to challenge placement. We didn't really have that in ready to go, and that was an issue that we faced early on. And now that's something where we have good communication, and people in student services or advising know where to send students, which is to me the department chair, to go through kind of how to do that. And then the reason that we moved to manually placing all of our multilingual students is we had started by placing them like we did everyone else, except for students who might need that actual multilingual specific course. But we found, as we were studying our results early on, that we were consistently underplacing students in that multilingual, and so we went to manual placement. I do need to say we only have 50 or so students a year who go through the multilingual track. So we are not talking about, we're talking about, approximately one student a week that makes that possible. So not necessarily something that is scalable everywhere. And then also that we are continually assessing and revising to make sure that the tool is up to date, that as things change at our institution or change in any of the measures that we're using, that we make tweaks. An ongoing challenge for us is funding. This is particularly true for summer or break reading. So when the highest number of our manual placements or 102 applications come in, tends to be when faculty are off contract. So we've dealt with that by having people like me who have different contracts do that reading. We've also had faculty sort of shift some of their service from the regular academic year into summer, for instance, which is not ideal, and it's not what I would recommend to anyone. And we have been able to, in a couple of cases, secure funding to pay someone to do it during the summer. Thankfully, when we look at both multilingual and English 102, we're still talking about under 100 students total each year. Next year, we're actually going to be piloting a GPA placement process with our student services folks, where we will look at the students' overall GPA and the grade they learned in their highest English course and high school. And then for right now, that's going to be a very small pilot, but if that's something we move to, we might keep the right class as an option for students who have been out of school for a longer time or have a GED or some other kind of alternative diploma. And then the other thing we learned is that when we first made this change, there was a lot of institutional data support to look at what happened, and we were able to figure out things like, oh, our multilingual placement isn't really doing what we thought it was. And so we need to kind of do that better now. Now that we've been implemented for a few years, that support has kind of gone to other areas, but we want to make sure that this is still kind of doing what we think it's doing. And we also want to see what's going on regarding disparate impact.
So we are, oh, sorry, go ahead,
Go
Jo.
for it. No, please go ahead. I'm needing to find a power cable actually, so.
Okay. So there's been some good questions in the chat or comments even that I think speak to the experiences that Joy and I have had as well, which is that it does feel really important to have faculty input at the point where students think they're ready to begin in English 102. We also have a similar process to what Joy described, and we are surprised by the number of students who get that option, because in our version of the right class, not everybody sees that option, the option to apply to begin in 102. A far greater number of students get that option than actually follow through and take it, and that has surprised us over the years. Our pass rates for those portfolios are probably about like what Joy said. The students who follow through for us tend to do a great job of making the case for why they're ready to begin in that class. And then we do have kind of some stragglers that are very kind of random. We're not sure why they applied, and the application materials aren't appropriate. So we feel comfortable telling them to begin in English 101. So I think the ways you're thinking about the, kind of nuance in placement, I think is really smart. Other thoughts, ideas that are resonating, things you'd like to know more about? Can unmute, can put it in the chat. If there isn't anything else right now, it's probably a good time to take a break. I have 2 links for you ready in the chat that I'll share as soon as we start the break. In the kind of third portion of our work with you today, we're going to talk through some kind of more general principles or questions to ask, and they're informed by 2 pieces. A graphic that is in an article, and you'll just need to scroll down. I put the directions in the chat. And then also TICA white paper. We have the sources and the links for them, but you might find it helpful to have those up as we're working through the next part. And I think we've lost Joy, is that right? So anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and put these in the chat. Let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll start again at 5 after your hour. All right, thanks.
Okay, welcome back. We are going to kind of talk now about some guidelines and ideas for building and modifying writing placement at your institution. And we're going to talk about two different frameworks that we think sort of should help kind of guide that approach. So now that we've talked about our own approaches and how we kind of got where we got, we're going to zoom out a bit and refocus on principles and strategies that can inform your work, because as I know Heidi's mentioned at least once, and we probably need to say again, we don't think what we do is by any means the only way to do it, the best way to do it, nor are we saying that you should be doing something that looks like this. So resuming back out now.
So the first framework is in that article that I put the link in the chat, and Brandon and I were talking over break. That whole issue of that journal of writing assessment is focused on placement and the two-year college, but it is applicable to every context, and the pieces in it are really helpful. I find the Henson and Hearn one especially helpful and useful. And then the one specifically for today has this what they call a roadmap in it. So this is from Maya Poe, Jessica Nastal, and why did I just blank on his first name? Anyway, their article, and the title of that article is "An Admitted Student is a Qualified Student." And so they write that this means that it's a capabilities approach with the imperative that students accepted into a community college, or I would say also a university, deserve the dignity of placement and curricular alignment that ensures their success. So they have 5 criteria for writing placement, and those are in those kind of shields at the top of this infographic. So there's our aim for fairness, advance instructor and student agency, which I think gets at nicely some of the nuance you're talking about with the, some DSP combined with some version of portfolio placement or challenge. Using professional literature to guide practice, use institutional resources to support retention, and then to integrate success efforts across the curriculum. So we find this roadmap to be a simple and powerful guide that you might consider as you're thinking through placement or continuing to think through placement and co-requisite work. So we'll draw on this roadmap as we explore some options for writing placements.
So the second framework we are looking at comes from the Two-Year College Association's 2016 white paper on placement reform, and TICA is part of NCTE. National Council of Teachers for English. While worth reading in its whole, these 5 guidelines we found especially useful as well, and we think they align really nicely with the criteria from Poe, Nastal, and Elliott. So regardless of the process, multiple measures, DSP, or some combination, TICA recommends that all writing placement practices be grounded in disciplinary knowledge, be developed by local faculty whose work is recognized and compensated by their institution, be sensitive to effects on diverse student populations, be assessed and validated locally, and be integrated into campus-wide efforts to improve student success. TICA encourages faculty and administrators to work collaboratively to develop the placement process that best suits the needs of their students and the capacities of their individual institutions. And over the next several slides, we'll look at each of these guidelines and the associated criteria from the other article in more detail.
So in the Poe et al. Article, they write, and this is a quote, "The function of writing placement is to create opportunities for student learning." I mean, that seems self-evident, but I think it's important to state out loud. So if that's our clear criteria, then we'll want to start with looking for ways to reverse disproportionate impact. So both statements, both the TICA statement and this roadmap, address this point, but they actually had it lower, and we moved it to the first criteria. We think this is where we should be starting. This is not necessarily where we started 15 years ago or 12 years ago, whatever it was, but it feels now like a blind spot, like that's where we should have started. So it's important when we think about aiming for fairness. The TICA statement categorizes it as being sensitive to disparate impact, so that we are from the beginning looking to develop a placement process that openly seeks to do a better job of serving historically underserved populations.
So we see locally developed placement practices as an opportunity to advance instructor and student agency. So bringing those two ideas together. It's also something that needs to work within the state ecosystem and be sensitive to whatever other local context you at your institution are dealing with. The process should include having faculty consider values and compensating faculty regarding placement practice and be conscious of implicit and explicit biases. So kind of tying back to if being sensitive to disparate impact is the first thing, then that's going to kind of run through all of the guidelines. And in this case, it's starting from what are we bringing to the table, whether we are consciously aware of those biases right now or not.
Third set of principles are about using what we know from the field, and the processes that you are already talking about are echo some of those. So working towards processes that use multiple measures that aim for construct validity, meaning they're appropriate for the task at hand, and that they're equity focused.
Again, we're focusing on local, this time in terms of assessment and validation happening locally, as well as thinking about placement as part of the conversation around retention and leveraging institutional resources to that end. So the goal being that the placement process is being assessed, again, addressing disproportionate impact, that it is connecting closely to the curriculum and engages faculty expertise at critical moments.
And kind of like we talked about when we talked about co-requisite pedagogy, it's really important that placement, especially when there are changes that disrupt systems, that require advisors to do different things or require the registrar's office to do different things, that as much as possible to foreground these changes as part of a larger set of student success initiatives and efforts, that they all are related, and ideally that the construct or the theory or the practices behind those placement processes are understood by others as well, that you are invested in equity and student success, and that's why some of these changes are happening.
Yeah, so when we're talking about kind of the integration throughout the institution, it's very important to recognize that almost everyone on campus is a stakeholder in kind of how placement happens. Some areas, of course, need to have direct input on whatever decision is being made. If it's going to cost money, you need to talk to budget people. If it's going to use a computer, you probably need to talk to IT. But in some cases, there are other groups that need to understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, and who they can talk to if they have more questions. This is an incomplete list that Heidi and I brainstormed about groups on our campuses we've needed to have conversations with. Some of these I think were surprises to me. So I was a little surprised. CWI's recruitment folks have historically used placement test as something to do in a high school with students, so that students can be like, hey, this is my math class or this is my English class, before they have even applied to come to the college. So that was something we had to take into account with the right class, and currently I think they still use the right class that way in the high school. Even though like our original conception was it was something that would be for enrolled students, at this point, there's no reason that it has to be that way. We were also a little bit surprised by how many areas were using compass scores for placement. And this was a weird thing that happened at our institution when we implemented co-rec, but we were still placing by compass. our career and technical programs, because there was no longer a course before English 101, which they had been using as a kind of prereq to get into the program or to take certain program courses, they started using compass scores. And then when we stopped using compass scores, that became another issue. So really, in short, pretty much everyone needs to know about placement practices and understand the rationale for the changes that are happening. Additionally, it's really important that kind of all areas of any office on campus understand, particularly if there are people who are working directly with students. One mistake we made at CWI during implementation is with a couple of departments. In one instance, we talked to the frontline employees who work directly with students, and we did not like explicitly include their like director level person in it. And then they were kind of like, what is going on? Why is this happening? Do my people know what to do? Not the best situation. Frustrated administrators are never fun. And in another situation, we had talked to kind of the manager level folks and expected that that information would get filtered down. I think this might have been in financial aid, and it did not. And then there were student questions, and that was not pleasant either. So being sure that kind of everyone is aware is hard, but important. It's also important to make sure that you know who's going to do what and in what time frame. So Heidi mentioned at Boise State, placement moving out of the assessment and testing office and into the writing program. Something similar happened at CWI, and we share some labor now where some of the labor happens by faculty or by me, the department chair, and some of the labor happens at assessment and testing still with our proctors like inputting scores. So we have to kind of have a very explicit understanding of who does what and when people can expect something to be done. It's also, I think, worth remembering that while these conversations have to happen at implementation, some of the conversations with some of the groups need to be renewed on an ongoing basis. So I talk to our one-stop people, and one-stop is our student services model, where basically if a student needs anything related to student services except for advising, they start at a one-stop, and then they get referred to, they either are helped by the one-stop representative or are sent to like a financial aid specific person or something, but they don't have to run around campus finding all the different offices. So I talk to the one-stop people and our advisors about every year, sometimes every other year, about first year writing, and about half of that is about placement, even though we've had no major changes in the past like 4 years, I think. But of course, if something is changing, then making sure that the people who might be affected by the change know what's going on is very important. And then finally, just getting feedback. So we've gotten feedback from students, we get feedback from faculty, and we, have ways of soliciting that. But we also get really good feedback from other areas in the college, particularly people like our one-stop folks who are helping students register for classes. And so we've done some major tweaks to language in the right class to make things clearer, and then instructions that will match up with what students are actually going to find when they get to a one-stop location, so that we're not promising something that's not going to happen or suggesting something that's not going to happen. So we've used feedback to make all of those changes. And we have now reached the end of this section and want to leave you with a chart that has key questions related to each of the guidelines we've talked through. We are going to be sharing these slides so you can refer back to these questions later. I'm not going to read through every single one of them at the moment, but I will leave it up for just a few seconds more.
And then before we open again for Q&A and then some institutional work time, we've given you some guides and some starting points and explained kind of our thought processes and context for when we revised our placement. So a few thoughts before we open it again for questions. What you do next year doesn't have to be what you do forever. I think planning in a pandemic is very different than planning when we thought we were so busy 8 or 10 years ago. So I think you should set. I'm a big fan of setting small goals and meeting them. If you can do only one thing, consider using high school GPA. There is research that shows that might be a better predictor. Try a year with no placement, or like some of you are already developing guided self-placement models. And if you can find the bandwidth at all, use it as a small R research opportunity. I mean, what impact are you having on student learning or on opportunities for student learning because you're doing this work that can feel so kind of labor intensive and behind the scenes and disconnected from the classroom, and yet can impact so many students. I think it's really important to keep in mind. And then consider doing something like reading the TICA white paper or the roadmap article with colleagues, or having a reading series around some of these issues. I know you also have all of this professional development in the spring, which is amazing, and we didn't have that. But I think, again, it's easy to get lost wanting to build something perfect when really making one change can still be a whole lot of work, and you'll still learn something, and you'll likely do better by students. So that's a few different kinds of caveats, I guess.
So I'm
All
going to
right,
drop,
so we're gonna.
I was going to say, I'm going to drop the link for the evaluation
Oh.
in, and as we do Q&A, we can certainly use the chat,
Mhm.
but it would be great if people want to unmute just to have a little bit of dialogue.
Absolutely. Todd, the sun is shining where you are.
Just a fake background.
Mhm.
Even the the sun beam is fake.
Oh, I mean, that could be the light. Sorry, I can't see myself. Oh,
Right.
yeah, I think that is fake actually.
I'm so sad.
It's a rare cloudy day today.
What thoughts are you all having? So we heard some in the chat about this kind of a version of DSP for the 101 co-rec decision, and then some modified portfolio or application for 102. Are there other variations people are already developing, or?
I can talk about that a little bit at GBC because we've been kicking around with our high, why did I just lose the word? Dual enrollment. With our high dual enrollment population and how young some of them can be, sometimes high school GPA is even a little bit tricky because we get them fairly early on. One thing we are doing, at least to take care of the top end of that related to English 102, and then also with some of our younger students, is to see what we can develop as far as Ed Ready is concerned, to have that just be kind of a double check along the way. But we're struggling with how to do this with extremely limited resources. That's the biggest challenge. I'm sure you could speak to that, Nick and Suzanne. You don't have to. I wasn't calling you all out.
I think concurrent enrollment is another really challenging kind of, I was going to say wrinkle, but that's not very nice to describe students as a wrinkle. Student population that we don't do it. So for us, it's only our students who are coming to Boise State who are, have signed up for an orientation session that take the right class. Our concurrent enrollment students who take it in the high schools take it on their instructor's recommendation and only in their senior year, at least so far. So, I mean, we have a little bit of a different kind of control there because we agree with you. We couldn't figure out a way to help a sophomore in high school really understand trying to understand what we meant in order to make informed decisions. So I think that is a real challenge and a pressure we'll only continue to face. Joy, how do you handle concurrent enrollment?
We do the same. So in the high schools, it's a decision that's made by the instructor teaching it. And then we do have dual enrollment students on our campus who take the right class, but they really only do that if they're trying to get into English 102 instead of 101. I don't think we have many. If they take it on our campus, they still would have to go through the right class. So they wouldn't have high school GPA, but we kind of account for that because we expect not all of our students to have high school GPA because we do have, a fair number of non-traditional students. But they also usually don't have test scores at that point. So they have to do really like to place into the college level course, they really have to have a pretty strong response to the literacy questionnaire and the reading portion. It's tricky. Yeah, there's not a really great solution. Hence why we really only use it, I think, for the 102, that at least that we've come up with so far.
I think as you're building your DSP portions, and maybe you all have already thought about this, one thing that has been really fun to work on when we've built, because we now license and build Right Class for other campuses. So as we've built them, especially for more community college partners, we have built more and more robust reading comprehension, but not, so some of it is having students reflect, summarize what they just read. Their questions geared at that. But the more important part are then questions that ask students to reflect on what they read. So was this challenging? Was it easy? What made it hard? So that actual self-reflection might be an interesting part of your DSP, even if it's not integrated into a system, it's fully DSP, right? But having students read a passage and then think about, do I feel like I have 100% understanding, a 50%, some ways for students to kind of wrestle with how challenging is this kind of reading for me?
Yeah, and we do have a couple questions like that, but there's one like at the very end, like after they've done the reading and done a little like writing sample kind of thing, even though we don't generally use that writing. Or it certainly doesn't fit into the algorithm. We only really use it if we're doing something manually. We have students we say something like, this is the kind of work you can expect to do early in a first semester writing course, and then kind of rate their challenge level. And it doesn't figure into anything, but it's interesting to go back and look and like how, if a student is challenging placement or if we're doing a manual placement, to kind of get a sense of how the student gauged the difficulty. Yeah, that is helpful.
Anyone else have questions or thoughts from your institution or perspective? All right, well, yeah, Elaine?
If I could ask a little bit more about the Right Class. And again, I understand that it's different depending on the context, but what kind of, like when the information comes out, is it in a score? Is it in a recommendation? How does that interact with the student information system? If you could kind of talk about how the systems talk to each other, that would be helpful.
Yes. So I didn't become an English department faculty assuming that I would be developing IP. And so this has been a big process over the last several years with my colleagues at Boise State. So we have learned over time and have worked with a local developer to, so that and I'm not going to use technical words very well, but anyway, there are processes that have been developed so that systems can talk to each other. And so the campus information system can directly pull the Right Class data into it. So, from a system perspective, it looks like a numerical score. The student doesn't see that. What the student gets is a placement result. So it says, thanks for completing the Right Class. You have been placed into English 101. Here's what you need to do next. Or it says, you've been placed into 101, you might want to consider the co-rec. Or it says, you've been placed into the co-rec. Or it says, you've been placed into 101 and your answers indicate that you might be a strong student and you might be ready to apply to begin in 102. So that's that kind of nuanced results that Joy was talking about. So there is some of that. So what the student sees is just words. They don't get a score of 70. There's no number attached, but behind the scenes those are set so that it can work as placement within the student information system.
Okay, and so just to follow up with that, so if an advisor is looking, they would see the numbers as well, and they would have to know what that translates to.
So for the Joy is on a slightly different platform because anyway, there's some technical things. With the current platform, an advisor could see that if they were a certain kind of advisor. So we have kind of writing advisors, and then we have kind of more general advisors. A general advisor just sees what the student sees, can go in and see this student is placed in 101. If a student challenges their placement, they're really upset by the placement they got, which happens less and less for us, pretty rarely now, but they would meet with our writing placement advisor, and she is able to see everything, every answer they gave, and even talk with them about, well, you said you read this piece and you said it was really hard. So tell me more about that. Or, you answered all of these questions saying that 101 seemed like the best match. Why are you, help me understand why you wish you had gotten the 102 placement. So she can give that, kind of use it almost as an advising tool.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And all of our placements just translate into a number. So it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 for these various things. That includes the students who are waiting on a placement and students who get placed into one of our multilingual courses. And the advisor just has to know, like, a 4 is you're placed into co-rec, and that's pretty much it. So yeah, I'm sure they have a cheat sheet.
Okay.
I have to have a cheat sheet because otherwise someone will be like, I have a student with a 4, and I'm like, what's a 4? What does that mean?
I think one of the unforeseen challenges that we hadn't thought through when we began this process, I mean, it's a challenge and it's also one of the strengths of this system, is that you have to think really carefully about data security. And so as those kind of pressures have ratcheted up, even though the right class only takes, it needs certain key, kind of student information pieces in order to make sure they're talking about the right student. And we have had to do an increasing amount of work on that kind of level of infrastructure and backup support and data security. So that is very different than how it felt even 8 years ago. So I think the advantage of something like DSP that is totally offline is that you don't have to worry. You have a different set of, data entry. Somebody has to enter the data somewhere at some point, but it might not be the same level of challenge. Just something to think about. Joy, did you want to go on to the final?
Oh, yep. I've got to give me just a second to get that back. All right. So we did want to do a follow-up poll to see if anything has changed from last time. So if you would take a moment to think about where you are.
At least somebody admits to being tired this time.
Oh no, we've made them more tired,
which was only
Heidi.
10% last time.
What's that?
But I think I'm young and naive,
That's
maybe.
Yeah, we made you more tired but less concerned. I guess maybe that's.
Yeah, that's actually maybe I think that might be a success.
It feels pretty honest. When we did the pedagogy workshop, we really didn't leave enough time for institutional discussions. And so with placement, it felt especially important to make sure there was time for, Caitlin, you're making me laugh, to make sure that there's time for you all to talk to each other. It sounds like you already have plans in place or plans that you're working on. I'm happy to just kind of hang out here for a while, but other than that, we wanted to make sure you had time to talk to each other at your institutions. We did also include the bibliography. I noticed a few typos or a few incomplete citations that were supposed to be my job to fix, and I forgot. And so I will make sure we do those before we share the slides with with Brandon and Theo, and before those make their way out to you. So it was great to see you all and work with you. We'll be here. Otherwise, feel free to work at your own places. Brandon, anything else before we?
No, just a big thank you to Heidi and to Joy. Thank you for all the folks in Nevada. It is Friday. Enjoy your weekend. We are near the holidays. Enjoy the holiday season. It's something we all need to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves. And we will look forward to continuing this series back up again in February.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
It was nice to spend a Friday afternoon with you.
Karen, thank you for that resource. I'm going to look at it right now.